In the last episode, we talked about the causes of the Industrial Revolution and why it happened in Great Britain first. In this episode, we're instead going to be talking about the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So, what happens because the world begins to industrialize? One of the first major effects of the Industrial Revolution is growing urbanization. So by urbanization, what we're really looking at is more and more people start to move to cities. So whereas before the Industrial Revolution, a majority of people lived in what we would call rural or country areas, working on farms or in agriculture in some way, shape, or form, people in a post-industrial revolution world move to cities, right? That's where the factories are. The second major change we need to talk about is the creation of new social classes. So, in previous periods that we've talked about, let me make that smaller for you. This was really the social class pyramid that we were looking at, for example, in feudal Europe, where a grand majority of people on the bottom are peasants or serfs, and there are smaller and smaller numbers of people who are above them. The bottom level, the serfs or the peasants, they're mostly agricultural workers. There isn't really a middle class, right? The serfs are the lower class, and then the knights end up, they are some form of noble, some form of aristocracy. We don't get a lot of middle class, and we get no movement. Well, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, we do get this idea of social mobility. People can move between social classes thanks to the Industrial Revolution and all of the new jobs and professions that it opens up for people. We also get the creation of a brand new social class. This brand new social class is the working class. They are urban workers. They are urban factory workers. And they sell their labor for wages. So they get paid hourly wages. Whereas before, peasants, right, they're paid in crops. They work and they work and they work on the farm, and eventually they are paid in crops. So that's the first new class that we need to talk about. The second class, part of this whole social mobility thing that we need to talk about, is the middle class. So the middle class is born during the Industrial Revolution, and they, as we can see here, really start to enjoy some of the characteristics that had only been reserved for the aristocratic or noble classes. They really start to emphasize leisure time, having time away from work to go to things like the theater, museums, out for picnics, out to parties. The novel grows and more people start to read. And these things differentiate them, make them different from the people in the working class who don't have leisure time. The middle class also tries to make it seem as though they are copying the lifestyles of the aristocratic class. These are some of the major components of middle class life in this period. A third change that we need to talk about is impacts on women. Different women in different social classes see different effects because of the Industrial Revolution. If you were a lower working class woman, you now could go work in a factory. So because factory work is not as labor intensive as farm work, women who were unmarried or poor women who were married could go get a job in a factory. Factory owners and managers also really wanted to hire women because they could pay them less money. So they could do exactly the same job as a man, but for half or less of the price. So if you are a working class woman, you could now support yourself, or you could add to your family's prospects. If you were a middle class woman, you started to become involved in something called the cult of domesticity. So this word should remind you of domestic, which means the household. So the kind of vision of what a perfect middle class woman was like was she was the perfect mother. She was the guardian of all that was good and right and moral and virtuous in the home. She was delicate and yet nurturing. She had to be protected from the harsh realities of the world. All of this kind of adds up into this cult of domesticity where people are almost worshiping women in this way. Then these middle class women who are able to employ household servants, so they have maids, they have cooks, right? Maybe they have valets or like assistants. Now they also have some free time, so they devote themselves to charitable organizations. These middle class women are working with their church to try and help the needy. They're trying to help reform prison systems and clean up the city and help the orphans and those in asylums. Other women start to ask for more rights. And this is really an economic argument. So here in this picture, what you're seeing is images of suffragists, so women who want the right to vote. And women are asking for this because essentially they are paying taxes if they're working and they have no representation. So this leads to an increase in women asking for the right to vote. And the last thing we need to talk about in terms of the effects of the Industrial Revolution are the poor working and living conditions. So there are no legal protections for factory workers at this time. There's no casing or protective railings around the equipment, so people fall into the equipment, they're injured, they can't pay for doctors, they can't get any paid time off, they can't get any protected time off at all. So if they are injured at work, they're just fired. And as you can see here in this image, children are working. There are no protections for children. The children are working in unsafe conditions. They're not wearing shoes, for crying out loud. This is not safe. So those are just some of the really horrible working conditions that we see happen because of the Industrial Revolution. Then the living conditions are also very bad. So they start to live in these buildings called tenements, which are like apartment buildings, but they were much, much more crowded, as you can see in this image, than your kind of typical apartment complex that you envision today. And this photograph is taken by a man named Jacob Riis, and he publishes a book called How the Other Half Lives that's full of his photographs from the slums in New York City about how people in America, most of them new immigrants, are living in the tenements, working in factories to give the new middle class the lifestyle that they're used to.